Hello everyone, welcome to Meat, Fish, Poultry Process Technology lecture series. My name is Shiv Prasad. I am an assistant professor at Department of Food Technology, Vignan's Foundation for Science, Technology and Research. So in our today's lecture, we will be having a discussion on one important concept, that is the spoilage of meat by infecting microorganism. So in this particular concept, we will be exclusively discussing about the infections. So what are all the different types of infections like endogenous infection as well as exogenous infection, and the factors which are affecting the growth of spoilage causing microorganism in the meat as well as meat product, and also the prophylaxis measures, that is the preventive measures which are in place which can exclusively combat against such kind of microorganism. So this is the things which we would be covering in our today's lecture. So before anything, so let us first define the word, that is spoilage. So the spoilage can be defined as any kind of a physical, chemical or microbiological changes which in turn renders the food product unfit for human consumption. Okay, to give you an example, so the chemical changes is exclusively means different components in the food will react with each other, in turn rendering the or hampering the quality of the food product, so which will lead into spoilage. Okay, so herein I have given you a picture of the meat slices. So the original color of the meat as well as after the interaction of the or the formation of the met myoglobin. So the met myoglobin, whenever it is formed, it will result or impart brown color to the meat. Okay, so this is exclusively because of the chemical reaction that is actually occurring in case of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the original transformation in case of the color of the meat from purple or pink to the brown color, which is highly undesirable. Okay, so this is about the chemical changes which is rendering the food product to the spoilage. So second in, we have the microbiological changes. So whenever we are talking about microbiological changes, it is exclusively the microorganism which predominates and causes the spoilage of the meat as well as meat product. So the microorganism can be either the bacteria, it can be the fungi, that includes both yeast as well as mold. So such kind of microorganism has an ability to produce enzymes. So the enzymes which can be produced by the microorganism can be lipase, okay, as well as protease. Okay, so the lipase as well as protease are the predominant enzymes which are produced by the microorganism. So the lipase, which is an enzyme which is produced, subjects or renders the food product to undergo lipolysis. So it causes the breakdown of the fat which is regarded as lipolysis, in turn rendering the food product to rancidity. Okay, so similarly the protease, which is nothing but the breakdown of protein in the presence of an enzyme, that is protease. So this breakdown of the protein can happen in the presence of oxygen or in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so in the presence of oxygen, it is regarded as proteolysis, that is breakdown of protein in the presence of oxygen is regarded as proteolysis, and the breakdown of protein in the absence of oxygen is regarded as putrefaction. Okay, so the putrefaction is highly undesirable because the byproducts that is produced in case of putrefaction is H2S, that is hydrogen sulfide. So this particular hydrogen sulfide will in turn impart bad odor as well as taste to the final product. Okay, so it imparts bad flavor to the final product, in turn rendering the food product to not fit for human consumption. So that is about the microbiological changes which are brought in by the microorganisms. So similarly, we have physical changes which exclusively happens during the transportation as well as the processing of the meat as well as meat product. So herein I have shown you a picture of the vacuum packaged meat. So during the transportation, if there is any kind of a damage in case of the packaging material, so what ideally happens is, so it will in turn gives way to the growth of microorganisms. So the microorganism will in turn seek an entry inside the packaging material and utilize the meat as well as the meat components and bring in the spoilage changes in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so this is about the spoilage. So to give you an overview, the spoilage can be defined as any kind of a chemical, microbiological as well as the physical changes which are rendering the food product not fit for human consumption. Okay, so now let us have an understanding on few of the important definitions. Okay, so herein I have defined the important definitions such as like the infection. So the infection can be defined as the invasion or multiplication of microorganism. So the microorganism can be either bacteria, it can be virus, or it can be parasite. Okay, so whenever they are seeking an entry inside the human body and they are propagating and multiplying in its number, then there is a possibility that they will infect the body and cause the infection. Okay, so this infection is exclusively caused either by bacteria, virus, or the parasite. Okay, so similarly we have two distinct infections. So the first one is the endogenous infection. So as the name itself suggests, endo means within as well as genus means born from. So the infection which is born within the body of an animal can be regarded as endogenous infection. So next is exogenous infection. So whenever we are talking about exogenous infection, so the exo means outside and the genus means born from. So the infection which is contracted by the meat or meat product outside the body. Okay, so that is about the exogenous infection. So it is of utmost priority that we understand the concept of endogenous as well as exogenous infection and to understand the concept of the variety of infections. Okay, so first then we have endogenous infections. So whenever we are talking about endogenous infections, so these are the infections which are caused in people by the consumption of meat from the infected animals. So if the animal has contracted a variety of disease such as like anthrax, it can be foot and mouth disease. So whenever an animal which has already contracted with a specific kind of a problem and it is having or expressing the symptoms of that particular disease, and if such kind of meat from the infected animal is consumed, then the consumer will experience infection characteristics. Okay, so that is of important thing. Okay, so besides that, the infection that is transmitted upon the contact with an animal is also of utmost priority to understand. So herein I have given important diseases or the infection which is transmitted upon contact with a specific animal. So we have anthrax, which is exclusively caused by Bacillus anthracis, and the possible sources can be the hides. So hides is nothing but the skin of an animal as well as the hair of an animal, and also the undercooked meat are the possible sources through which this particular Bacillus anthracis can infect the human beings. Okay, so similarly we also have bovine tuberculosis. Okay, so this bovine tuberculosis, the bacteria which is responsible for causing bovine tuberculosis includes Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So the possible sources through which this particular bacteria can seek an entry into the human body is through the raw milk. If the milk is not being processed properly, if it is not properly pasteurized, then we can always expect the presence of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which was previously the indicator microorganism for pasteurization. Okay, so and also the contact with the affected carcass. So if an human being is coming in contact with the infected carcass which has suffered bovine tuberculosis, then there is a possible chances that the human being will also contract the similar kind of an infection. Okay, so third in we have brucellosis, which is one of the most predominant and the deadly type of disease. So this particular disease is caused by Brucella species. Okay, so one of the most predominant type of species which is involved in causing brucellosis is Brucella abortus. This particular Brucella abortus causes abortion in case of human being as well as in case of animal. So this is one of the important deadly disease which can be contracted by the human being just by coming in contact with the animals. Okay, so these are the important type of infections which can be contracted by the human beings upon contact with an animal. Okay, so next then we have the most diseases which is arriving from the in vivo infection. So inside the infection, that is the endogenous infection, in case of the meat animals, are acquired by the consumption of the infected carcasses by specific kind of microorganisms such as like bacteria as well as parasites. So whenever we are talking about the bacteria, the predominant genus which is infecting is Salmonella, and in case of parasites it is parasitic worms. So these are the two important things which has to be duly taken into consideration whenever we are talking about endogenous infection. Okay, so in case of bacteria, whenever we are talking, it is Salmonella. Okay, so in case of Salmonella, the most predominant type of species includes the Salmonella typhimurium. So this particular Salmonella typhimurium causes a disease called as Salmonellosis. So in case of human being, if we are affected by Salmonella typhimurium because of the consumption of the meat which has already infected by the Salmonella typhimurium, we will contract or we will experience the symptoms towards Salmonellosis. So the symptoms towards Salmonellosis includes fever. Okay, so it can be diarrhea, and also it can be nausea and the stomach cramp. So these are the possible symptoms of Salmonellosis, which is the causative agent is Salmonella typhimurium. Okay, so the second type of bacterial infection which is predominantly seen as an endogenous infection is Listeriosis. So this particular Listeriosis is exclusively caused by the bacteria called as Listeria Monocytogenes. So Listeria Monocytogenes is an predominant pathogen which is leading to the Listeriosis. So the human beings which have contracted this particular kind of a bacteria will experience or exhibit certain kinds of symptoms such as like sepsis and encephalitis, okay, so these are the two prominent symptoms which is exhibited as an important symptoms of Listeriosis. So in case of sepsis, what ideally happens is whenever the antibodies that is produced, okay, so it in turn will be released in the bloodstream and they cause inflammation. They cause severe inflammation. So similarly, encephalitis means inflammation in the brain as well as spinal cord. Okay, so the inflammation in the brain as well as spinal cord is encephalitis. Okay, so these are the two severe symptoms which are predominantly found in the human beings who have contracted this particular bacteria, that is Listeria monocytogenes. Okay, so the next important type of bacteria is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So as we are already aware, this Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes tuberculosis disease, that is bovine tuberculosis, and also it increases the chances of contraction of Crohn's disease. So the Crohn's disease is the severe infection to the stomach. Okay, so the inflammation in the stomach will be an important symptom of Crohn's disease. Okay, so which is exclusively caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So these are the specific type of bacterial infection which are exhibited in case of human beings. So next then we have the endogenous infection, which are exclusively caused by parasites. Okay, so these are the most prevalent infections which are exclusively caused after the ingestion of the meat which has parasitic worms. So the most prominent types of diseases towards parasitic infection includes Trichinella spiralis. So Trichinella spiralis is the responsible parasite which causes trichinosis. So the possible symptoms towards this particular disease include diarrhea, and it also includes abdominal pain, and vomiting. So these are the three prominent symptoms towards the trichinosis disease, which is caused by a parasite, that is Trichinella spiralis, and it is a roundworm. Roundworm of type Trichinella. Okay, so this is the first prominent infection which is under the category of endogenous infection. Okay, so next then we have Tania Saginata. Okay, so Tania Saginata is another parasite which causes taniasis. Okay, so the possible symptoms towards this particular infection includes the abdominal pain, it also includes fever, and it includes the weight loss, okay. So these are the three prominent symptoms towards the disease taniasis, which is caused by Tania Saginata, which is again a parasite, and it is a tapeworm. Okay, so the next important infection towards the parasite is Toxoplasma Gondii. Okay, so this particular parasite causes toxoplasmosis. Okay, so whenever we are talking about toxoplasmosis, we shall discuss about the important symptoms towards this. So it includes muscle pain and also the fever as well as headache. Okay, so these are the three prominent symptoms towards toxoplasmosis, which is a infection which is caused by Toxoplasma Gondii. Okay, so these are the three prominent endogenous infections which are exclusively caused by parasite. Okay, so let us now understand about the exogenous infections. Okay, so whenever we are talking about exogenous infection, so it is of utmost priority that we will discuss about one of the important endogenous infection, that is bacteremia. Okay, so the bacteremia is nothing but the presence of bacteria in the bloodstream of an animal. So this kind of contamination ideally happens after the death of an animal. So after the animal has been slaughtered, and if the bacteria has sought an entry inside the blood of an animal, then it gives the bacteria a way to contaminate every other visceral organ in case of animal body. Okay, so this is about the bacteremia. Okay, to give you an overview again, so bacteremia is a kind of a disease wherein the bacteria presence will be there in case of the blood. So whenever the bacteria is there in the blood, it will in turn seek an entry to every other visceral organ of the animal, and in turn it will contaminate the entire carcass as well as visceral organ. Alright, so this bacteremia effectively involves contamination because of usage of the infected knives. Okay, so as you can clearly see in the picture, if the knife which is used exclusively for dissecting of the visceral organ as well as the carcass is contaminated, then in turn the entire carcass as well as the visceral organ will be contaminated. And also if the captive pistol bolt which is exclusively used for the stunning of an animal is having any kind of a bacterial presence, and if it is not properly sanitized, in turn it will give the way to the bacteria inside the bloodstream, and thereby it will contaminate the entire carcass as well as the visceral organ. Okay, so this is the prominent exogenous infection, which is the bacteremia. So far we have understood the definition of the spoilage. So wherein we have actually studied it is the physical, chemical or microbiological changes which is rendering the food product to spoilage or non-consumptionable. Okay, so let us now have an understanding on what are all the potential sources which is in turn rendering the spoilage of the meat as well as meat product. So herein the first important source of contamination can come from the meat animal itself. So the meat animals such as like the poultry, sheep, goat as well as cattle might actually carry a numerous variety of microorganism, and in turn these type of microorganism can render spoilage of the meat as well as meat product. So this becomes the first and potential source of contamination of the meat. Okay, so second then we have the water. So as we are already aware, so water is one of the important ingredient which is used in case of carcass washing as well as visceral organ washing, and also the water is exclusively used for the sanitation of the meat industry. Okay, so the floors and everything are significantly washed with the water. So if by any chance so water is contaminated, as it naturally harbors a variety of microorganisms, so there is always a possibility that there is a transmission of the microorganism from the water to the carcass as well as visceral organ. Okay, so that in turn might render the food product to undergo spoilage. So water is one of the second most source of contamination of the meat as well as meat product. So third in we have air. So air can also be a potential source of contamination. Okay, so the one thing that we will have to effectively understand here is, so air do not naturally harbor any kind of a microorganism. It is not a natural environment for the growth and development of microorganism, but the dust and dirt particle which are present in case of the air can naturally consist of variety of microorganisms. So these microorganisms or these type of dust and dirt particle, whenever it is landing on the surface of the meat which is openly kept in an industry or in case of a meat shop, then it might transmit any kind of a microorganism, in turn that might render the food product to contamination. So the air can also be a potential source of contamination of meat as well as meat product. So the next potential source of contamination can come from the handling as well as processing of the meat as well as meat product. So whenever an individual who is in directly contact with the meat, so he or she has to ensure that they are in their safety gear. That means there has to be good hygienic practices that has to be effectively in place, so that there is always a, because there is a transmission of infection or microorganism from the meat handler to the carcass or the visceral organ. So in turn that might contaminate the entire meat product. So what we will have to effectively ensure in here is, so there has to be a proper safety gear that has to be owned by the handler who is in direct contact with the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so also the processing equipment which are effectively used for the processing of meat as well as meat products, such as like the meat slicer, so they'll have to be subjected for proper cleaning as well as sanitation process. So that will in turn ensure that the contamination load or the microorganism load will be effectively decreased in case of your final product. Okay, so this is about the final or the sources of contamination of the meat as well as meat products. So let us now understand individual source of contamination in detail. Okay, so first then we have animal as the potential source of contamination. So whenever we are talking about animal, so what can be the potential source of contamination can be coming from exclusively the animals. So whenever we are talking about animal, so the potential source of contamination can come from the surface flora. That means the skin of an animal. So the skin of an animal consists of tiny hairs also, such as like in case of cattle, it consists of tiny hairs. So they might actually carry a potential number of microorganisms, which in turn might render the food product to undergo spoilage. Okay, so the surface as well as the flora of the respiratory tract. Okay, so as we are already aware, we have exclusively understood that bovine so bovine tuberculosis is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, so which is one of the important microorganism which harbors in the respiratory tract of an animal. Okay, so respiratory tract can be a potential source of contamination, and also the flora from the gastrointestinal tract. So the gastrointestinal tract eventually harbors in numerous variety of microorganisms such as like coliforms. Okay, and also it involves Salmonella as well as Shigella. Okay, so these are the potential microorganisms that might be present in case of the gastrointestinal tract of an animal. So the skin flora as well as the respiratory microflora and the gastrointestinal microflora can be a potential source of contamination as far as animal is concerned. So that is the reason why there has to be a good and animal husbandry practices which will in turn ensure that all this potential source of contamination as far as meat product is concerned is effectively reduced. Okay, so besides these particular contamination, it can actually come from hides, hoofs and the hair, which might actually contain microorganism, and the microorganism from the soil, manure which is being fed to the animal, and also the feed and water which is actually fed to the animal. So these can be the other potential source of contamination as far as animal is concerned. Okay, so in case of poultry effectively, so the contamination can actually come from the feather and the feet of the poultry, which in turn carries a heavy load of microorganism. Okay, so the potential microorganism that might be present in case of poultry is Salmonella. Okay, so in case of poultry, so the most effective type of microorganism that can be present is Salmonella. Okay, so this particular Salmonella can induce or cause Salmonellosis depending on what type of species that is present. For example, Salmonella typhimurium will cause typhoid, Salmonella paratyphi will cause paratyphoid. Okay, so it is one of the important microorganism which is present in case of poultry effectively. Okay, so the skin of many meat animal might contain a variety of microorganisms such as like the micrococci, staphylococci and beta hemolytic streptococci. So these are the potential microflora which is present on the surface of the animal skin. Okay, so herein I have given you a classification which effectively describes what are all the possible microflora that can be coming from the meat animal. So in case of skin microflora, we have staphylococci, micrococci as well as corynebacterium. And also in case of respiratory microflora, we have staphylococci as well as streptococci. And also in case of intestinal microflora, we have coliforms, bifidobacter, salmonella as well as shigella. So these are the potential type of microflora which might actually come from meat animal. Okay, so how exactly one can actually combat against such kind of potential contamination? So there has to be a proper animal husbandry practices. So these animal husbandry practices effectively involves proper grooming of an animal and then subjecting an animal for proper washing prior to slaughtering, because effectively the skin microflora will be reduced whenever we are subjecting an animal for proper grooming as well as washing. Okay, so the proper animal husbandry practices will effectively decrease the potential pathogenic microorganisms such as like Mycobacterium, which causes bovine tuberculosis, and Coxiella burnetii, which causes cow fever, and Listeria Monocytogenes, which causes Listeriosis, and Salmonella, which potentially induce or cause Salmonellosis, and also enteropathogenic E. coli and numerous viruses. Okay, so whenever we have proper animal husbandry practices in place, so we can effectively combat against variety of pathogenic microorganism. Okay, so this is about the animal as a potential source of contamination of meat as well as meat product. Okay, So the next potential source of contamination is the water. So as we are already aware, so water is mostly used for the washing of the carcass as well as visceral organ as well as the cleaning of the floor in case of an abattoir. Okay, so in case the water is harboring any kind of a potential microflora, it can transmit to the meat as well as meat product, and in turn it might render the meat product to undergo spoilage. Okay, so whenever we are talking about water, it is important that we actually understand what are all the different possible sources from which these contamination can actually come from. Okay, so first thing we have the natural aquatic. So natural aquatic is nothing but the stream as well as pond as well as the river which are naturally present. Okay, so they might actually harbor a numerous variety of microorganisms such as like Pseudomonas, Cyanobacteria, E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella as well as Vibrio. Okay, so these are the potential microorganisms which are naturally present in case of natural water bodies such as like ponds, stream, rivers, etc. Okay, so if the natural water bodies has the presence of E. coli, Salmonella as well as Shigella, it is effectively understood that these natural water bodies are effectively contaminated with the intestinal microflora, because these type of microorganisms are effectively present in the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so if the natural water bodies are contaminated with the intestinal microflora, we can potentially enumerate E. coli, Salmonella as well as Shigella from the natural water bodies. Okay, so this is about the first natural aquatic classification. So the second end we have the soil dwelling microorganism. So soil dwelling as in the microorganism which might be present in case of the soil, which when washed away and it reaches into the natural water bodies might contaminate with the potential soil dwelling microorganism. So such kind of microorganism includes Bacillus, Clostridium, Acetobacter as well as alkali genes. So these are the potential source of microorganisms which are present in case of the soil. So whenever there is a wash water which is reaching into the natural water bodies, they might actually contaminate with such kind of microorganism. Okay, so next then we have intestinal microflora. So the intestinal microflora effectively involves the coliforms, Salmonella as well as Shigella. So these are the potential source of intestinal microflora which can actually contaminate the water. Okay, so it is have to be understood that the kind of microorganism which is present in case of the water will depend on three important factors which we have previously studied, whether it can be the natural aquatic, or it can be soil dwelling, or it can be the intestinal microflora, which are in turn contributing the type of microorganism that is present in case of water. Okay, so the presence of Escherichia coli, which is one of the important microorganism, that is the bacteria which belong to coliform. Okay, so it is gram negative, facultative anaerobe. Okay, so it is a gram negative facultative anaerobe and lactose fermenting microorganism, that is a bacteria. Okay, so the presence of Escherichia coli indicates fecal contamination in case of meat as well as meat product. For that matter, any food product, if we are taking into consideration the presence of Escherichia coli, that is E. coli, indicates that the product has been contaminated with the feces, because as we are aware, it is present in the gastrointestinal tract. So the presence of Escherichia coli will in turn gives us an idea that the product has been contaminated with the feces. Okay, so how exactly one can actually tackle this problem of microbial load in case of water? So in case of meat as well as any food industry, so the water has to be chiefly subjected for chlorination, which in turn will reduce the microbial load to an extent that it is not present. Okay, so the chlorination, the chlorine residue should be anywhere between 0.2 ppm, which is the maximum limit. Okay, so the subjecting of the water for chlorination induces or reduces or imparts effective filtration, which reduces the microbial content in case of water. Okay, so that is about the water as another potential source of contamination of meat as well as meat product. So next then we have the air. So as we are already studied, air do not naturally harbor any kind of a potential microorganism. It is the dust as well as the dirt particle which might contain potential microorganism, which on deposition on the surface of any kind of a food product will induce any kind of a changes and render the food product to undergo spoilage. Okay, so air do not naturally have any kind of a microorganism. It is the microorganism which are chiefly present on the dust as well as dirt particle, which in turn contaminate the food product. Okay, so the microflora of air is transient and variable. So it is depending on the environment. So if the environment is highly contaminated, then you can always expect a higher load of microorganism to be present in case of dust as well as dirt particle. Okay, so the biological pollutants are the major pollutants which are present in case of dust as well as dirt particle. Okay, so what are these biological pollutants? It might include the cells, okay, the animal hair, the pollen grains as well as algae and protozoa, bacteria, yeast molds, spores, viruses as well as aerosols. So these are the potential biological pollutants which can be present in case of dust as well as dirt particles. Okay, so whenever this dust and dirt particle is landing or on the food product, so these biological pollutants will be transmitted to the meat as well as meat product, and in turn that will render the food product to undergo spoilage. Okay, so this is about the biological pollutants. So how exactly one can effectively combat this particular problem as far as air is considered? Okay, so in case of meat as well as meat industry, to give you an example, in case of any food industry, they use effectively HEPA filters. Okay, so what do you understand by HEPA filter? It is high efficiency particulatory air filters, or they also use air curtains. Okay, so these air curtains are effectively installed in the doorways. Okay, so what this air curtain does, they will blow a swift of air and in turn maintains a positive pressure inside the meat industry, and thereby it will not let any kind of an air entering from the outside of the meat industry. Okay, so thereby it is protecting the microflora that is chiefly present in case of air, in turn not rendering it to undergo any kind of a contamination. Okay, so that is about HEPA filter as well as air curtain. So air curtain as well as HEPA filter, what they does, they will maintain positive pressure. Okay, so whenever someone is opening the door, so what it is happening, so there is a blow of air which is coming from outside the meat industry to the inside of the meat industry. Okay, so the outside air might actually carry a potential number of dust and dirt particle which might contain microorganism. To avoid that, what we are doing, we are installing air curtain which will blow and maintain a positive pressure, in turn rendering the outside air not entering inside the meat industry. Okay, so that is how we can effectively combat with the aerial microflora. Okay, so the microflora above irrigated land is less than the dry land, because whenever the land is damp, so it is not the dust particle will not be in the air. Okay, so similarly the dry air contain more organism in comparative to the moist air. Okay, so the number of microorganism in case of air may be reduced under natural condition by sedimentation process, sunshine, or washing by rain or snow water. Okay, so these are also the natural ways of effectively reducing the number of microorganisms present in case of air. Okay, so this is about air as an potential source of contamination as far as meat as well as meat product is considered. Okay, so next then we have another important source, that is during the handling as well as processing. So how exactly the meat as well as meat product has to be handled. If it is not handled well, what can be the potential source of contamination that can be observed? Okay, so whenever we are talking about processing as well as handling, so the contamination can come from the processing equipment. So herein I have shown you a meat slicer. So this meat slicer has to be effectively disinfected and sanitized after every unit operation. Okay, so after every operation it has to be clearly sanitized. So if it is not sanitized well, it might actually harbor a lot of microorganisms which might contaminate another lot of meat which is being subjected for slicing. Okay, so the next is the ingredients. So the ingredients which are chiefly used for the preparation of meat as well as meat products, so they have to be properly protected and it has to be properly kept in a place which is devoid of microorganism, and it has to be properly covered. So if it is just exposed to the air, so the dust and dirt particle can land and it might proliferate and bring about a lot of changes. Okay, so next thing we have product to product, that means the cross contamination. So in the same place, if we are storing numerous variety of products like dairy and egg, cut fruits and vegetable, fish and fish product, and then fats and meat as well as cooked rice as well as beans. So if we are storing all such kind of product in the same place, there is always a possibility of transmission of microorganism from product to product, which is called as cross contamination. Okay, so next one is the packaging material. So the packaging material has to be effectively sterilized. Okay, so before packing of any kind of a meat as well as meat product. Okay, so whenever we are talking about handling as well as processing, so the contamination can actually come from the processing equipment, the ingredients that is used for the preparation of meat as well as meat product, and the cross contamination which happens when between the product to product of different category, and the packaging material which is being used for packaging of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so whenever, how exactly we can avoid such kind of a problem? So to avoid such kind of a problem, we will have to subject the processing equipment for cleaning as well as sanitation purpose. So the cleaning is effectively with the help of detergent. So in case of food industry, specifically the meat industry, we are using sodium carbonate. Okay, so which is chiefly used in case of meat as well as meat industry, and sanitation is effectively used by means of using of sanitizer. So sanitizer can be the hot water, okay, or it can be iodophore, or it can be quaternary ammonium salt. Okay, so these are the potential sanitizer which are chiefly used in case of meat as well as meat industry. So to combat effectively the problem of contamination coming from handling as well as processing, so we will have to subject the equipment for proper cleaning using a detergent such as like sodium carbonate, and also we will have to subject them for proper sanitation by using a proper sanitizer such as like hot water, iodophore as well as quaternary ammonia. So which are the permitted sanitizer in case of meat as well as meat industry or the food industry as a whole. Okay, so besides this, so we will have to follow good hygienic practices. Okay, so GHP stand for good hygienic practices. Okay, so these hygienic practices includes how exactly one has to be dressed. That is, a proper apron has to be worn, which is a clean apron, and proper head net to prevent hair follicle falling into the meat as well as meat product, and also proper gloves, protective gloves has to be worn, because there is always a transmission of skin microflora to the product, and also a proper mask has to be worn. So these are the good hygienic practices which should be in place whenever a person is in direct contact or handling the or processing the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so besides that, there has to be standard operating procedure. So SOP stands for standard operating procedure. which effectively gives us an idea as to how exactly the meat equipments have to be handled. To give you an example, the meat slicer. At what interval of time the meat slicer has to be properly sanitized, and by using what detergent and what sanitizer, and how long they have to be exposed to the detergent as well as sanitizer, and what is the standard operating procedure of this particular meat slicer. Okay, so all of this will be effectively described in case of standard operating procedure. Okay, so the standard operating procedure should be in place, and every handler who is handling the meat equipment has to abide by the standard operating procedures. Okay, so whenever the standard operating procedure is in place, we can effectively tackle the problem which is happening from the handling as well as processing of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so far we have understood the definition of spoilage and also what are the possible sources of contamination which might in turn render the food product to undergo undesirable changes and bring in the spoilage. Okay, so now let us have an understanding what are the spoilage characteristic of meat as well as meat product. To give you an example, whenever there is a contamination of a meat, so an individual who is consuming that particular product, what kind of symptoms that they can actually exhibit. So herein I have given you a table which effectively describes the characteristic of bacterial meat poisoning. Okay, so the first one we have the Salmonella, which is the causal microorganism. So the Salmonella, when it is present in case of a meat and that particular meat is consumed, so what ideally happens? Okay, so the normal incubation time, okay, for this particular Salmonella ranges between anywhere 8 to 72 hours. So in the intestinal tract of an individual who has consumed the meat which has contaminated with Salmonella, so the normal incubation time to exhibit any kind of a symptom might range from 8 to 72 hours. Okay, and the reservoir of this particular microorganism in case of animals will be the gut of animals. So if the animal meat is effectively contaminated with the gut microflora, then we can always expect the presence of Salmonella in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so what can be the characteristic symptom? So the human being will experience abdominal pain, okay, and the diarrhea, nausea, which is an urge to vomiting, and also pyrexia. So pyrexia is nothing but increase in the body temperature, which is nothing but the fever. Okay, so these are the characteristic symptoms of Salmonella contamination and the consumption of the meat which has been contaminated with the Salmonella. So next then we have Staphylococcus aureus. So Staphylococcus aureus is the causal microorganism, and the incubation time period to exhibit any kind of a symptom range anywhere between 1 to 6 hours or often 2 to 4 hours. So this is a very shorter period of time which shows any kind of a poisoning. Okay, so the normal reservoir of this particular Staphylococcus is the skin, nose, cuts in case of man as well as animals. So these are the potential sources, and what can be the symptoms? The symptoms can be the abdominal pain, diarrhea, it can be nausea, it can be pyrexia, that is nothing but the increase in the body temperature, and also besides them we have excessive salivation. Okay, so excessive salivation, and there will be vomiting, and there will be subnormal temperature. Okay, so then there will not be very increase in the temperature, there will be a subnormal temperature increase in case of the person who has suffered poisoning from the Staphylococcus. Okay, so next then we have Clostridium botulinum. Okay, so which is one of the potential food poisoning microorganisms. So this particular Clostridium botulinum has an ability to produce botulinum toxin. Okay, so this particular botulinum toxin is a potential neurotoxin which affects the brain as well as the nervous system. Okay, so this Clostridium botulinum, the incubation time is anywhere between 2 hours to 8 days, and often it can range anywhere between 12 to 48 hours. Okay, so the reservoir for this particular microorganism is the soil, and also the possible symptoms of this will include difficulty in swallowing, double vision, and there will not be any increase in the temperature or fever, and there will be respiratory paralysis. So these are the potential characteristic symptom which is exhibited whenever Clostridium botulinum poisoning is happening. So it has to be ensured that there has to be proper animal husbandry practices in place so that we can effectively avoid such kind of proliferative microorganism in case of meat as well as meat product, and also there has to be proper processing of meat as well as meat product which can effectively reduce the number of potential food poisoning causing bacteria. Okay, so this was about the spoilage characteristic as well as the characteristic of the bacterial meat spoilage poisoning. Okay, so next then let us have an understanding on what are all the various factors which are affecting the growth and multiplication of microorganism in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so whenever we are talking about the factors, it is of utmost priority that we can effectively classify them into two distinct types, that is the intrinsic factor as well as extrinsic factor. So the intrinsic factor are the factors which are inherent to the food matrix. Okay, so extrinsic factors are the environmental challenges which is posed to the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the intrinsic factors effectively includes the nutritional content, the pH, that is H+ ion concentration, the moisture content or water activity, the redox potential or oxidation reduction potential, and the presence of inhibitory substances, that is biological structure in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so whenever we are talking about extrinsic factors, the two important extrinsic factors which we will be effectively studying is the temperature as well as the concentration of gases. Okay, so let us now have an understanding on the intrinsic factors as an important factor which is affecting the growth of microorganism in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so first then we have nutritional content. So whenever we are talking about nutritional content, so depending on the availability of the nutrients, okay, or based on the utilization of the nutrient, the microorganism can be distinctively classified into three types. So what are these three types? Saccharolytic, lipolytic as well as proteolytic. So saccharolytic is nothing but the microorganism which can effectively utilize the sugar or the carbohydrate, and lipolytic are the class of microorganism which can effectively utilize lipids, and the proteolytic microorganism are the microorganism which can effectively utilize protein as a source of energy. Okay, so let us have an understanding on saccharolytic. So saccharolytic are the microorganism where they hydrolyze complex carbohydrate. So to give you an example, we have Bacillus, Clostridium as well as Pseudomonas. So these are the important type of microorganism which are saccharolytic by nature. That means they can hydrolyze complex carbohydrates. Okay, so similarly we have lipolytic microorganism. So this lipolytic microorganism are the microorganism which can produce a specific kind of an enzyme called as lipases. Okay, so this lipases, what it does, it will hydrolyze triglycerides. Okay, so it will hydrolyze triglycerides and then in turn use them as a source of energy. Okay, so to give you an example, we have Micrococcus, Staphylococcus as well as Pseudomonas as the potential example which belong to the category of lipolytic microorganism. Okay, so next then we have proteolytic type of bacteria, so or microorganism. So as the name itself suggests, so proteolytic, that means they can effectively degrade protein by producing a specific type of an enzyme. So this enzyme is regarded as proteinases. Okay, so the enzyme, the proteinases can significantly hydrolyze protein and produce numerous amino acids. Okay, so this amino acids will effectively be used as a source of energy for the microorganism. To give you an example, we have Staphylococcus, Bacillus as well as Pseudomonas as the potential microorganism which are proteolytic by nature. That means they have the ability to produce protease which in turn hydrolyze protein and produce numerous amino acids which are in turn used as a source of energy for the bacteria or microorganism growth as well as multiplication. Okay, so this was about the nutritional content. So depending on what is the available nutrient, So we can always expect such kind of microorganism to be growing in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the next intrinsic factor that we would be so the next important intrinsic factor that we would be studying is the pH. So whenever we are talking about pH, it is the H plus ion concentration. So the H plus ion concentration will exclusively define whether it is an acid medium or whether it is a basic medium or if it is a neutral medium. So the H plus ion concentration is significantly important whenever we are talking about pH. So the pH or hydrogen ion concentration is effectively significant whenever we are talking about pH. Okay, to give you an example, if the product has higher concentration of H plus ion, so that means that such kind of product is acidic. Okay, so if the H plus ion concentration is effectively low, okay, so lower H plus ion concentration will means the product is basic. Okay, so if H plus ion concentration is neutral, then it is neutrophile. So this was exclusively based on the H plus ion concentration. So higher the H plus ion concentration, the product will be regarded as acidic or acidophiles might actually proliferate as a microorganism in case of acidic food products. So similarly, if the H plus ion concentration is extremely less, then such kind of product is regarded as basic, and if H plus ion concentration is normal throughout, then it is regarded as neutral. Okay, so considering this as a factor, so every microorganism has a cardinal pH points. So these cardinal pH points includes the minimum pH below which the microorganism will not grow, maximum pH above which the microorganism will not grow, and the optimum pH is the neutral pH which is required for the microorganism to grow, multiply and divide in its number. Okay, so taking this into consideration, we can effectively classify microorganism into different pH categories. So first thing we have acidophile. So acidophile are the class of microorganism which can effectively grow in a pH anywhere between 0 to 5.5. Okay, because it is an acidophile. Okay, so next thing we have neutrophile. Okay, so neutrophile are the class of microorganism which have an ability or can grow in a pH anywhere ranging between 5.5 to 8.0. And next thing we have alkalophiles. So whenever we are talking about alkalophiles, they have a significant pH range anywhere between 8 to 11.5. Okay, so in general, so the bacteria grows faster in a pH which is ranging anywhere between 6 to 8. So similarly we have yeast as well as mold. So yeast require a pH of 4.5 to 6.5 while mold require 3.5 to 6.8. So this is the difference in the pH range whenever we are talking about different class of microorganisms. So bacteria grows faster in case of a pH of 6 to 8 while yeast and mold require a lower pH. So that means they can actually proliferate in case of acidic medium as well. Okay. So what exactly happens when there is a dramatic difference in case of pH? So what ideally happens is the disruption of the plasma membrane. So the bacterial plasma membrane will be disrupted. So because of which what happens? The enzyme activity is inhibited. So the enzymes which are specifically involved in various pathways for synthesizing of ATPs, so they will be inactivated. Okay, so in turn what happens? The proton motive force or the altering the activity of membrane transport protein. Okay, so the proton motive force PMF, what we usually designate it as. Okay, so the proton motive force is an important force which is chiefly required for transportation of food or the nutrient from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. So the bacteria or microorganism has to utilize it. So this PMF will be inactivated. Okay, so there will not be any force which will contribute to the transport of the protein or any kind of a nutrient from outside the cell to the inside of the cell to be used as an energy source. Okay, so in turn what happens? The decrease or dramatic change in the pH will disrupt the plasma membrane. So when the plasma membrane of a microorganism is disrupted, it will induce the oozing out of the cell constituents. Okay, so cell constituents such as like the sugars and the proteins will ooze out from the cell and in turn rendering the microorganism to undergo death. Okay, so similarly, the important enzymes which are chiefly required for the utilization or the production of ATP will be hampered, and also the proton motive force will be hampered. So these are the possible changes which are brought in when there is a dramatic change in case of pH. Okay, so herein I have given you a table which effectively describes the pH of various food products. So the meat, in case of meat, because we are chiefly studying about the meat, so the pH of meat is anywhere between 5.6 to 6.2, which is close to neutral. That means most of the microorganisms which might proliferate to meat as well as meat product are neutrophiles. Okay, so besides this, we can also expect certain acidophiles to be growing in case of meat as well as meat product, because the broad range of pH that they have is 5.6 to 6.2. Okay, so this was about pH as an important intrinsic factor, which in turn has an effect on the growth and multiplication of microorganism in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the next important factor that we would be discussing is the water activity or the moisture content. So as we are ideally aware, so the moisture content in case of muscle of a meat is somewhere around 75%. So this is chiefly important. Why? Because the higher the moisture content, higher will be the activity of microorganism and greater will be the probability that the changes will be brought in, which is in turn rendering the meat as well as meat product to undergo spoilage. Okay, so the water activity or the moisture content plays a significant role in the shelf life of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so water is often one of the major constituent of the food, which in turn predicts the safety, stability as well as the quality of the food as well as food product. Okay, so as I have already told you, in case of meat, the available moisture content is 75% and hence it is a perishable food product. Okay, so moisture content is extremely high, so it is a perishable food product. That means it can easily harbor a variety of microorganism, which in turn renders the food product unsafe for consumption. That is, the safety of the food is coming into picture here. Similarly, higher the moisture content, so the stability of the food product will also go low. Okay, so the stability as well as the quality are the three important factors which has to be effectively taken into consideration whenever we are discussing about the water activity. So let us now define what exactly water activity means. Okay, so the water activity of a food is the ratio between the vapor pressure of the food when it is completely undisturbed balance with the surrounding air and the vapor pressure of the pure water under the identical condition. Okay, so the water activity is usually measured as equilibrium relative humidity, that is ERH. So the water activity, that is AW, is equal to ERH divided by 100. So this is the equation which gives us an idea about water activity. Okay, so the water activity scale in case of a food product will range anywhere between 0 to 1. It cannot be beyond 1. Okay, so 0 is for the bone dry product, while the pure water will have a water activity of 1. Okay, so depending on what kind of food product it is, we can have we can expect the range of water activity in the food matrix. So ideally what happens, the food product can range, the water activity in case of food product can range anywhere between 0.2 to 0.99. So 0.22 is for very dry foods, while 0.99 is for moist food products. Okay, so by regulation, it is of utmost priority that the water activity in case of most of the food product has to be significantly lower. That is, it has to be anywhere between 0.85 or below. So why exactly it is important? Because it will make the food non-hazardous. So why it is making the food non-hazardous? Because most of the bacteria and most of the microorganisms, specifically the bacteria which are food pathogenic bacteria, so they require a water activity of somewhere around 0.9. So this is the minimum water activity which is required by the pathogenic microorganism in case of to proliferate and contaminate the food product. So that is of important concern. Okay, so that is effectively has to be taken into consideration. But the pathogenic microorganism including Clostridium botulinum cannot grow if the water activity is lower than 0.91. Okay, so that is the minimum water activity which is required by most of the pathogenic microorganism to proliferate and bring in a lot of changes in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so most mold as well as yield require a water activity of 0.8. Okay, so most of the dried meat as well as meat product, since the water activity of them is extremely less, so they can always have the proliferation of yeast as well as mold, because the dried meat as well as meat product has a water activity which is lower, and therefore yeast and mold can effectively grow in case of dried meat as well as meat product. Okay, so this was about the water activity as an important intrinsic factor. Okay, so next thing we have another important intrinsic factor, that is the redox potential. So the redox potential is nothing but the oxidation reduction potential. Okay, so oxidation. So whenever we are talking about oxidation, it is nothing but loss of electron. Okay, so and then reduction is gain of electron. Okay, so this is the oxidation reduction potential, which is ideally expressed as EH, and it is measured in terms of millivolt. Okay, so the microorganism in turn display a variety degree of similarity to oxidation reduction potential of their growth medium. So depending on what growth medium it is, so they will exhibit whether they are oxidative microorganism or reductive microorganism. Okay, so the aerobic microorganism require positive EH, while the anaerobic microorganism requires negative EH. So depending on this, we can actually classify food product whether what kind of microorganism can be expected out of that particular food product. So herein I have established a table which gives you an indication on what kind of microorganism can be significantly present in what type of food product. Okay, so specifically speaking towards the meat as well as meat product, so the raw meat will ideally have minus 200 EH. So that means the proliferative microorganism in case of raw meat will be anaerobes, because they require negative EH to grow and proliferate and multiply in its number. Okay, so similarly in case of minced meat, they have positive EH, that is plus 225. So the proliferative microorganism here is aerobes. Okay, so this is towards the perspective of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so in case of your raw meat, we can always expect the anaerobic microorganism to be grown, and in case of minced meat, we can always expect a positive, since there is a positive EH, it is the aerobic microorganism that will be growing in case of minced meat. Okay, so moving on, we have another important intrinsic factor, that is inhibitory substances. So talking exclusively with respect to meat as well as meat product, so we have the shell of an egg. So the shell of an egg, it is exclusively made up of with calcium carbonate. Okay, so it is acting as a barrier and protecting the inside content of the shell from the outside environment. Okay, and also it is inducing or creating a barrier for the microorganism to proliferate inside and induce or bring about a lot of changes. So similarly, the skin of the fish, so the skin as well as the shell of the fish contains a lot of gelatin as well as collagen, which naturally acts as an inhibitory agent. Okay, so similarly the fat covering of the meat, so in case of pigs and other meat animals. So the fat layer which is covering the skin will act as a potential barrier and prevents the entry of outside pathogen inside the food product and bringing about a lot of variety changes. Okay, so this was about the inhibitory substances as an intrinsic factor which can have a effect on the growth and multiplication of microorganisms. So these are the important intrinsic factor. So next then we have potential extrinsic factor. Okay, so two potential extrinsic factor that we would be covering in today's lecture are temperature as well as the concentration or availability of gases. Okay, so whenever we are talking about temperature, so environmental temperature is one of the most important factor which is having an effect on the growth as well as multiplication of microorganism. So as we are aware, so every microorganism will have a cardinal temperature. So what does cardinal temperature means? A minimum temperature below which no growth occurs, a optimum temperature which grows is most rapid, and the maximum temperature above which the growth is not possible. So these are the three important cardinal points as far as temperature is concerned. Okay, so every microorganism has a potential cardinal point. Okay, so that means they have a minimum temperature, maximum temperature as well as optimum temperature. So let us understand more about these type of classification. So based on the temperature of microorganism, they can be grouped as the psychotropes, because psychotropes has a minimum temperature of -5 and an optimum temperature of 15 degrees centigrade and a maximum temperature of 20 degree centigrade. So the potential example for them includes Pseudomonas as well as Vibrio. Okay, so the next important type is psychotropes. Okay, so psychotropes has a minimum temperature of 0 and an optimum temperature of 25 and the maximum temperature of 30 degree centigrade. Okay, so the potential example for the same includes Pseudomonas, which is gram negative, and Orthobacter, which is gram positive, and Rhodotorula, which is a yeast, and Alternaria, which is a mold. Okay, so similarly we have mesophiles. Okay, so mesophile has a minimum temperature of 20 degrees centigrade and an optimum temperature of 25 to 37 degrees centigrade and the maximum temperature of 45 degree centigrade. To give you an example, we have Streptococci and most important spoilage causing microorganism, that is E. coli. So they are mesophilic by nature. Okay, so then we have thermodurics. Okay, so thermodurics have a minimum temperature of 25, optimum temperature of 37 and the maximum temperature of 55 degrees centigrade. That means beyond 55 degrees centigrade you cannot expect this particular microorganism class will not be growing. Okay, to give you an example, we have Bacillus species, okay, and also Enterococci, Mycobacterium and Micrococci. Okay, so these are the potential thermoduric microorganism. So similarly we have thermophiles. Okay, so whenever we are talking about thermophiles, so they have a minimum temperature of 45 and the optimum temperature can range anywhere between 55 to 65 degrees centigrade and the maximum temperature is anywhere greater than 80 degree centigrade. So to give you an example, we have Bacillus stereothermophilus. Okay, so it is one of the indicative microorganism for sterilization process. Okay, so next then we have extremophiles. Okay, so the extremophiles has a temperature range anywhere between -20 to maximum, that is 122. Okay, to give you an example, we have Methanopyrus candleri. Okay, so which is an extremophile. Okay, so another important class which we have to study in extremophiles is Archaea. So they can withstand a higher temperature. Okay, so greater than 122 degrees centigrade. Okay, so this is about the classification of microorganism taking into consideration temperature as a factor. Okay, so based on the temperature of storage also we have two distinct classifications. So first one is the refrigeration temperature as well as the room temperature. So in case of refrigeration temperature, we can always expect the psychotrope as well as psychophiles to be predominant in spoilage. Okay, so similarly in case of room temperature, we have mesophiles to be a predominant type of microorganism which is leading to the spoilage. Okay, so that is the reason why there is a significant temperature range that has to be used or for individual product. Okay, so else it is leading to the spoilage of the meat as well as meat product. So the next important factor, that is an extrinsic factor, is the availability of gas or the concentration of different gas. Okay, so the oxygen is one of the most predominant gases which comes in contact with the food and influence the redox potential and finally bring about the spoilage. So as we are aware, so the presence or absence of oxygen will have an influence on the EH, that is oxidation reduction potential of the environment. Okay, so similarly the presence of oxygen is also chiefly important. Okay, so based on the availability of oxygen we have different classes. So first thing we have aerobic. Okay, so aerobic microorganism are nothing but the microorganism which can chiefly grow only in the presence of oxygen. Okay, to give you an example, we have Mycobacterium tuberculosis which causes bovine tuberculosis. So similarly the another type is anaerobic microorganism. So anaerobic microorganism are the microorganism which can grow only in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so to give you an example, we have bacterioids. Okay, so next then we have facultative anaerobes. Okay, so facultative anaerobes are the class of microorganism which can grow both in the presence and absence of oxygen. Okay, so which includes E. coli, which is a facultative anaerobe. Okay, so next then we have Microarrow Files. So this Microarrow Files are the class of microorganism which can grow in an extremely low level of oxygen. Okay, to give you an example, we have Campylobacter. Okay, so this is the classification of microorganism based on the availability of oxygen. So what we will have to do, we will have to protect our meat as well as meat product. So what we are doing, we are effectively imbibing a particular type of packaging technique like cap as well as map, where the variation among the concentration of the gases is predominant. In turn it will increase the shelf life of the meat as well as meat product. Okay, so the storage of the food in case of atmosphere containing increased amount of carbon dioxide up to 10% is referred to as modified atmospheric storage. That is nothing but MAP. So modified atmospheric storage is nothing but MAP. Okay, where the concentration of carbon dioxide is up to 10%. Okay, so it blocks metabolism by denaturation of the enzymes. So most of the bacteria has an enzyme which is responsible for production of ATP. Okay, so by increasing the carbon dioxide, and if the bacteria are aerobic by nature, so what ideally happens is it blocks the metabolism by denaturing the enzymes. So the enzymes are denatured and thereby there is no production of energy and the bacteria will ultimately undergo death. Okay, so higher carbon dioxide in case of meat, okay, will shift the microflora from gram negative to lactic acid bacteria. Okay, so lactic acid bacteria in the presence of higher carbon dioxide will be predominant. Okay, so most of the meat as well as meat slices are vacuum packed. So in case of vacuum packed meats also, there is a possible amount of microorganism which can be enumerated. Okay, so among bacteria, so we have lactobacilli which are relatively resistant as they occur in case of vacuum packaged fresh meats and in case of bacon, whereas the Pseudomonas and Acromonobacter species are susceptible. Okay, so these species such as like Pseudomonas is highly susceptible for vacuum environment, while the lactobacilli, which is a bacteria, are resistant. That means it can resist in the vacuum and then it can proliferate and multiply in its number. Okay, so this is about the concentration of gas as an important extrinsic factor which is responsible for the proliferation and multiplication of microorganism in case of meat as well as meat product. Okay, so this is all for today, guys. I hope this concept of the spoilage of microorganism and the different factors which is responsible for the spoilage of microorganism is effectively understood by each and every one of you. Thank you very much, guys.